Good morning, everyone. I'm Russ Cohen, and here we are along the glorious Riverwalk footpath along the Housatonic River in the scenic town of Great Barrington, Massachusetts in the Berkshires. And we're here this morning to look at the edible wild plants that are growing along Riverwalk. And this is a great place to see and learn about edible wild plants. It's not a great place to actually pick and harvest them, but it's a great place to learn about them. And you'll see some familiar plants that you'll know from your own neighborhoods, perhaps growing in your own property where it would, of course, be okay to harvest and eat them. This is a planted tree, but there's many wild cousins of the same species growing along Riverwalk. This is a somewhat unusual tree species called a hackberry. And one really fun thing about the hackberry is the wardiness of the bark, which shows off fairly well here where you have these ridges sticking up, and that's quite unusual. On this particular tree it shows up somewhat, but I've seen other hackberry trees where it's even more dramatic. So it's a fun landscape tree to have to look at even if you didn't eat the fruit. So that's one thing to look for when you're trying to figure out if you have a hackberry tree. The other thing is, if you look at the leaves, you'll see the leaves are asymmetrical. So you see how they're crooked like that? And so I look for that too. And the edible part on a hackberry is the fruit. So what you want to look for at this time of year is a shiny small green ball on a little stem coming out from the twigs of the hackberry. And that's a developing fruit, and it will be ripe in the fall, and sometimes it will persist through the winter. And it will get probably about a 1/4 inch in diameter, or maybe slightly less. And then the color will be a sort of a reddish brown color on the outside. And hackberry has two edible parts. So the very outer layer of a hackberry fruit is very sweet, and it tastes like a date. So that's really fun, and you can nibble that part off, and then in the very inside of the hackberry is this starchy seed, which is also good tasting. But in between the two layers is a shell, and it's not like an M&M candy shell. It is a shell, like a shell that you find on a nut. It's thin, and you can actually bite through it with your teeth, and that's certainly possible, but I wouldn't say that is going to appeal to most people because our palates are kind of spoiled with having, seedless grapes and seedless raisins and stuff like that. So we're not used to eating fruits that have shells in them. But that did not deter the Native Americans at all. They certainly would eat the outer part, eat the inner part, and pound it all together and eat everything together, and that was fine. But hackberries are fun for nibbling the outer part off, certainly, even if you don't break the shell with your teeth and eat the inner part. Just nibbling the outer part is quite good. And I have gathered hackberries from wild trees and propagated little hackberry trees in my nursery. And my trees are still rather diminutive, but I hope in a year or two that they'll be big enough for me to be able to start planting out in the landscape and diversifying sites that don't have them. Here at Riverwalk, there's quite a few, but it'd be fun to get some hackberries growing in places that don't have them because it is a somewhat unusual tree species. It's going to come around the edge of the railing here to look at another one of our native wild mints. How to recognize members of plants in the mint family. You look for the opposite leaves growing across from each other, and you look for the square-sided, 4 equal-sided stem that you can feel by twirling it in your fingers. And when I mentioned the wild bergamot, I was talking about how mints fall into two basic categories, the culinary categories, the sweet mints and the savory mints. And I would place this into the sweet mint category because if you scrunch up a leaf and sniff it, it has a sharp pepperminty type flavor. So this one you could use for making mint tea, mint julep, mint ice cream, mint candy, stuff like that. And this is the Pycnanthemum muticum. So when this one blooms in the summer, the flower isn't that showy, but I would have to say out of all the species I know of, the flowers of the Pycnanthemum muticum attract more interesting pollinators than anything else that I have deployed in the landscape or have propagated in my nursery. So if that is something that would interest you, to plant a pollinator-friendly plant that you could eat too, this Pycnanthum muticum, the broadleaf, or sometimes called the clustered mountain mint, would be an excellent choice. All right, let's go back along the walk and see what else we could find. Well, actually, we're getting a clue right here from seeing some nutshells along the pathway here. So nutshells like this are likely to be butternut shells. Usually when you see it more egg-shaped with a little point to it, that's the typical shape of a butternut. If this were spherical and round, it would be a black walnut. These are two closely related species in the juglans genus, and they're both edible. So it isn't really critical to know which one you have, because either one is fine. So here's a tree with a label on it. So this always makes it easy when you see that. So black walnut trees have compound leaves. So if you look up into the tree, you can see the leaflets like sumac that we saw before, where you have one leaf and then a whole bunch of leaflets coming off of it. And if we come over here, let's see if I can reach up. I'm going to stand on the railing and see if I can jump up and grab a leaf. Yes, okay. And bring that down. So one of the ways you can distinguish black walnut and butternut is if you just scratch the stem of the leaflet and give it a smell, you often get a very spicy fragrance. And that smell is the same as the smell on the husk that surrounds the nut that'll be ripe in, for butternuts it's September, for black walnuts it's October. And as I said before, the difference between black walnuts and butternuts when the nuts are ripe is that black walnuts are egg-shaped and, black walnuts are round and butternuts are egg-shaped. And the butternut, the nut inside the butternut, is relatively mild, and then the black walnut is relatively assertive, but and strongly aromatic, but they're both edible. And I wouldn't say that black walnuts are that good for eating just plain, but they're really good mixed with honey in various baked dishes, like black walnut baklava is really good. And so here we are. So this would be a tree that you would look for nuts to fall underneath. Once again, if it were a butternut, it would be September, and if it would be a black walnut, it would be October. And you'll see, if it were black walnuts, they look like old green tennis balls just piled up underneath the tree. And you can gather those, and what I typically do is stomp on them to get the husk, as much of the husk off as I can. And then we'll hose off the remainder from water with my rain barrel at home. And then for the nuts I want to grow trees from, I store them in a plastic bag in the fridge until I sow them. And the nuts I want to eat, I allow them to dry for about 6 weeks. And drying the nut is a great way to facilitate separating the nut shells from the nut meats, because the nut inside the shell will shrink a little bit. And so when you crack the nuts open, the pieces will fall out of the nut shells better than a fresh nut, because a fresh nut, it's hard to separate the nut meat from the shell. All right, let's see what else we can find. Okay, so here along the edge of Riverwalk in a gravel parking lot, we're encountering this species right here, and this is called pineapple weed. And when I teach this to people, a lot of people say, that's chamomile, isn't? And they're sort of right, because this is a close wild relative of chamomile, and you also use it to make tea. So what I'm going to do is just pull this plant out, and then we'll take it off to the shade. But first, let me just tell you, you see that the ground is very gravelly right here where this plant is growing, and that is very, very common. I typically see this plant growing in very poor gravelly soil. That is its habitat preference. And although it is a native species to the Pacific Northwest, it's not native to New England. And it's a plant that has a very cosmopolitan range now, so it's naturalized in Europe and places like that. But wherever you find it, you typically see it growing in this very gravelly soil. Okay, so let's take this plant into the shade where I can talk to you about it more. All right, so once again, this plant is called pineapple weed. And the reason is because of its flavor. So this is a flower right here. It never gets any petals. So that's one way to tell it apart from chamomile, because chamomile flower would have the white petals coming off, and this plant never produces any petals. And the whole plant has a pineapple-y flavor, but it's most pronounced in the flowers. So that's what I typically suggest people focus on. So to know for sure that it's pineapple weed is what you would do is just squeeze the flowers and give it a sniff, and it will smell like canned pineapple. And so you make a tea from this plant just by picking the flowers off and steeping it in hot water for a few minutes, and then you get a very nice flavored tea which tastes like what you smell like when you pinch the flowers. And I don't know if this has any of the same medicinal properties as chamomile tea. It may, I just don't know. But it is a fun plant to make tea from. And around now, the end of May, as we're filming this, is when I typically see this plant at this stage. It should be around for another several weeks, and then by midsummer it will be gone. But this is a good time to gather it to make the tea from pineapple weed. All right, let's see what else we can find here.
So here at Riverwalk, we work to diversify our habitat with a variety of plants, and we really try to go for local natives. And Russ was so kind yesterday when we were doing some reconnaissance about what we had available for our talks to bring along some of his own native plants, and we had the help of our Greenager interns to plant them. And so we're really excited to have a few new species at Riverwalk that we'll be working to support to increase the diversity yet again of our riparian habitat. Russ is just watering some of these plants now, and our Riverwalk Greenager interns will be keeping a close eye on them. It's been fabulous to have you here today. Every time you come to Riverwalk, I learn so much more. Your expertise is really wonderful, and the way that you provide your information, not only from the human perspective, but from the pollinators and the birds and other things that are benefiting, is really inspirational.
So I've very much appreciated and treasured my partnership with Riverwalk over the years, because this has been a great project to collaborate with. And this goes back to my days working for the Masson Fish and Game Department in the Riverways program, which became the Division of Ecological Restoration. And then since I've retired and playing the role of Johnny Appleseed for native edible species, I've also had an opportunity to bring some of the plants from my nursery to further diversify what's here at Riverwalk with additional things. So Riverwalk is a great example of a citizen-driven restoration project where they took a rubble-strewn eyesore that was neglected by the town and turned it into a spectacular showpiece by cleaning it up, removing the rubble, removing the invasive species planted with native species, and now it's an asset to the community instead of a neglected area. And this is something that should be replicated throughout not only Massachusetts, but in any place where rivers have been abused. They should be brought back to the beneficial functions that they should be contributing to the communities where they flow. And so here at Riverwalk, it's been great for me because of the particular interest in native plants. And so I have been leading walks here for many years, talking about the edibility of plants and talking about edible weeds and invasives as well as natives. But this has been an excellent showpiece to show off native plants. And this is a place where people can walk and appreciate the plants. And while this isn't really a great place for people to collect and eat plants growing here at Riverwalk, it's a great place to see the plants growing in the natural riparian habitats. And many of these species are very appropriate for people to establish in their own yards. And perhaps they'll get the idea from seeing the plants at Riverwalk that, gee, this plant is nice. It would be nice to have this in my own yard. And then they can establish their own growth there. And of course, once the plant's growing in your own yard, you can nibble on it all you want. So I hope you've enjoyed this little excursion we've had along Riverwalk with me this morning and learned a few things about these edible plants that we've encountered along the way. And I hope that we'll be able to get together in person sometime and do some more wild edibles here along Riverwalk in Great Barrington, or some other spot along some other river in the future. So thank you very much.